A woman vanished without a trace deep inside a national park. Search teams failed, and years passed with no answers. But then, out of nowhere, a dog returned from the woods, carrying something in its mouth that would unravel a truth more haunting than anyone imagined. What really happened in those trees, and what did she find that was never meant to be discovered? Before we begin, let me know where you're watching from, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Now, get comfortable, because this story will stay with you long after it ends. The sun had barely risen over the sleepy town of Ash Hollow, Oregon, when Emma Caldwell locked her front door, slung her well-worn camera over her shoulder, and called out to her golden retriever, Scout. He bounded into the passenger seat of her dusty Subaru with the familiar energy of a dog who'd done this 100 times before. At 58, Emma had spent the last 2 decades capturing the quiet beauty of America's forgotten wilderness. A widow for nearly 10 years, she found her solace not in people, but in places untouched by noise and time. Crater Ridge National Park was her sanctuary, especially the northern trails rarely visited by tourists. That morning, the air was crisp, the sky brushed with pale gold, and she had one goal in mind: to reach Pine Hollow Bluff by sunset and photograph the first snowfall dusting the pines. Rachel Caldwell, her 34-year-old daughter, was used to her mother's spontaneous treks. Emma always left a note on the kitchen table, always texted when she set up camp, and always sent a picture before nightfall. So when that message didn't come by 6 p.m., Rachel tried not to worry. But by midnight, worry had morphed into panic. Calls went unanswered. Emma's phone rang into silence. Rachel drove straight to the ranger station at Crater Ridge the next morning, clutching her mother's itinerary and a growing fear in her chest. The rangers responded quickly. Emma was known and respected as unofficial steward of the land. A search team was assembled within hours, with trained volunteers and tracking dogs. But as morning turned into afternoon, and afternoon into dusk, they found nothing. No trail markers, no footprints, no signs of a campfire. Just wind through trees, and the growing sense that the forest had swallowed her whole. Then, just before dawn on the second day, something happened that none of them could have predicted. Out of the trees came Scout, mud-caked, limping, and panting heavily. The dog staggered into the ranger station alone. His paws were raw, his coat matted with burrs and streaks of sap. But most alarming of all was what he carried clenched between his teeth: a torn piece of red and black flannel. Rachel's breath caught as a ranger gently pried it from the dog's mouth. It was unmistakable, her mother's favorite hiking shirt. The cloth was damp, stained with something dark, and ripped as though by claws or thorns. Scout winced and nudged the fabric toward Rachel, then sat down, eyes wide and fixed on hers, as if trying to speak. The air in the ranger station grew still. Even the radios crackled more softly. There was no mistaking the meaning. Emma was still out there, but something had happened, something that left her dog terrified and alone. Rachel dropped to her knees and hugged Scout tightly, feeling his heartbeat race against her chest. He had come back. He had found his way through miles of wilderness, through snow-dusted trails and shadowed ravines, to bring them a sign. But was it a sign of life, or a goodbye? Ranger Mike Denton, a veteran of 20 years, stepped forward with a solemn face. "This means she made it at least as far as wherever Scout just came from," he said. "And if he's made it back, he might be able to take us there." Rachel nodded, brushing tears from her cheeks. "Then we go. Now." But it wasn't so simple. Scout was exhausted. His pads were blistered and bleeding, his legs trembling with each step. He needed rest and water before he could lead anyone anywhere. They treated his wounds, gave him food and warmth, and as he curled up at Rachel's feet, he let out a low, whimpering sigh, like a soldier finally off the battlefield. Rachel sat beside him, running her fingers through his fur, whispering her mother's name like a prayer. Outside, a storm rolled in from the north. The search would have to wait for the clouds to pass, but no one slept that night. Rachel kept the piece of flannel close, staring at it under the pale light of a lantern. She remembered Emma wearing that shirt when they camped at Pine Hollow years ago, just the two of them, long after the funeral, when silence between them had finally softened into peace. She remembered Emma's laughter, her calm certainty in the face of thunder, her way of seeing light where others saw only darkness. Emma wouldn't give up, and neither would Rachel. By morning, the fog was lifting. Scout stood on shaking legs and looked toward the forest, tail low but steady. He was ready. Rachel strapped on her boots, zipped her coat, and looked to the ranger team with new fire in her eyes. They had a direction. They had a guide. And deep in the woods, somewhere among the mist and the towering trees, her mother was waiting. As dawn settled into pale gold across Crater Ridge, the fog began to peel away from the treetops, like a curtain drawing back on a vast, hidden stage. The woods were heavy with dew and silence, the kind of silence that made every step echo louder than it should. Rachel tightened the straps on her backpack and glanced down at Scout, who stood ready at her side. His injuries had been cleaned and bandaged, and though still moving with a slight limp, his posture had changed. No longer the panicked dog that stumbled into the ranger station. Scout was now focused, alert, and determined. He remembered the way, and the moment they unlatched the trail gate, he took the lead without hesitation, sniffing the ground and glancing back as if to say, "Follow me and stay close." The team behind Rachel was small but resolute. Ranger Denton, 2 veteran search and rescue volunteers named Carl and June, and a younger park biologist named Luke, who had studied Emma's wildlife photography for years and admired her from afar. They moved single file through the narrowing trail, Scout weaving through the underbrush, nose twitching with every trace of scent. The wind was low, the air thick with pine and earth, and the deeper they went, the more Rachel felt the weight of the forest pressing in. An hour passed, then they crossed a shallow stream where Scout paused, circled, then continued. Around midday, Carl called out softly. Near a mossy boulder lay a broken hiking pole, lightweight aluminum, snapped clean in half. Rachel rushed forward, heart thudding. It was Emma's. Her initials, EC, were still etched near the handle in the way she'd marked all her gear. Rachel picked it up gently, cradling it like a fragile relic. Nearby, Scout began to whimper and sniffed frantically at the base of a tree. There, claw marks gouged deep into the bark, climbed 5 feet high. It looked like bear territory, but something about the pattern felt wrong. The scratches were wide set, too wide, and there was no accompanying fur or tracks in the mud. June exchanged a glance with Denton, who frowned and muttered, "No black bear I've ever seen leaves marks like that." Still, the team pressed on. Scout grew more restless, darting ahead, then circling back to make sure Rachel was close. They came upon a small clearing where the underbrush had been flattened in a rough, circular pattern. In the center lay a camera lens, cracked but still intact, partially buried beneath fallen leaves. Rachel knelt, brushing dirt from the glass. It was a wide-angle, Lensimer's favorite for landscape shots. The strap had been cleanly severed, as if sliced rather than torn. Around them, the woods felt suddenly too quiet. No birds, no rustling branches. Even the breeze seemed to hold its breath. Luke scanned the treetops nervously. If something startled her enough to drop her gear, she would have run. Rachel looked around the clearing, eyes searching for any sign of where her mother might have gone. Scout suddenly barked twice, sharp and urgent, then took off toward the west. Without thinking, Rachel followed. They hiked for another hour, the terrain growing rougher with each step. The trail narrowed to a faint game path, winding through dense thickets and climbing uneven ridges. A few times, they had to stop and lift Scout over fallen logs. His energy was flagging, but he refused to quit. Each time Rachel tried to make him rest, he would paw at the earth and press forward. They passed patches of disturbed soil that looked freshly turned and came across a torn granola bar wrapper, the kind Emma kept in her side pouch. Rachel held it up with trembling hands. "She's close," she whispered. "She's so close." By late afternoon, the team reached a ridge overlooking a shallow ravine. Scout halted at the edge and wind tail low, body stiff. Down below, something glinted in the sunlight. Carl descended first and called back up. "There's gear down here. Looks like someone tried to climb." Rachel hurried down the slope and found herself staring at her mother's rope line, tied taut between 2 trees like a makeshift descent system. The end of the rope was frayed, as if it had been cut or worn through. At the base of the ravine, half hidden under brambles, lay Emma's pack. It had been slashed open, the contents spilled and weathered. Most of it was ruined soggy notebooks, a broken flashlight, scattered trail mix, but tucked in the side pocket, miraculously dry, was a small leather case containing Emma's backup SD cards and notes. Rachel clutched them to her chest, as if they were a heartbeat. Her mother had been here. She had camped, or fallen, or fled. But she had survived long enough to leave signs, maybe long enough to still be alive. Suddenly, Scout let out a low growl, the sound vibrating deep in his chest. The team froze. From the edge of the ravine came a faint rustling sound, branches moving without wind. Then silence, nothing more. Luke raised his hand. Let's not wait to find out what that was. They agreed to retreat for the evening. The light was fading, and they needed time to review what they'd found. As they climbed out of the ravine, Rachel looked back one last time and whispered, "Hold on, Mum, I'm coming." That night, back at the ranger station, Rachel sat hunched over the rough wooden table beneath a flickering fluorescent light. Her mother's SD cards laid out before her like sacred relics. She barely blinked as Luke inserted the first one into his laptop, his hands steady but his eyes shadowed with the weight of the day. The others had gone to rest, but Rachel refused. Sleep felt impossible. Out in the woods was a trail still warm, a mystery still breathing, and the closest thing to a clue rested in the fragile metal sliver now loading on the screen. The images began as expected: misty pine canopies, macro shots of frost on leaves, distant elk crossing through low fog. Emma had always had an eye for quiet majesty, and even now, her work spoke like a whisper to the soul. Rachel's throat tightened as photo after photo passed by, each stamped with a date and time that built the final hours of her mother's known movements. Then the images changed. In a series of photos taken just before sunset 2 days earlier, Emma's framing became erratic. The focus shifted sharply. Trees blurred. Her lens caught glimpses of movement not centered in the frame. Something dark, something tall, just out of reach. And then there was one photo that made Luke freeze. He zoomed in slowly, dragging the image toward the corner where a figure loomed behind the trees. It wasn't clear, not by any stretch, but it was enough to make Rachel lean in. So close her breath fogged the screen. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. It was something else. A silhouette half shrouded in the blur of motion, with broad shoulders, 2 long limbs, and an unnatural curve to its spine that seemed to defy posture. Emma had captured it just before she fled or disappeared. Rachel's hand trembled as she pressed it to her mouth. "What is that?" Luke shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but it's not supposed to be there." He pulled up metadata, confirming the timestamp matched the last known photo Emma had taken. Just after this frame, the photo stopped. Whatever happened next hadn't been documented, but Emma must have known what she'd seen, and it had terrified her. The next morning, Ranger Denton and June gathered to examine the image. Carl, who'd once served in the military before retiring into wilderness work, studied it in silence before saying softly, "That's no forest animal. Whatever it is, Emma saw it. She probably tried to get away before it could get close." The team began speculating. Could it be a misidentified mountain lion, a human in strange gear? Or was it something else entirely, something that had eluded both science and common sense? Luke, though skeptical, reminded them of Emma's often staked out hidden dens, old animal trails, secret watering holes known only to seasoned photographers. She might have stumbled across something most people were never meant to see. He said. Rachel took out the damaged notebook they'd found in the cave near the ravine. Most pages were illegible, water-stained and smudged, but there was one she'd read over and over. Scrawled in hurried, uneven handwriting were the words, "It's watching. I must stay hidden." That line repeated twice more, as if her mother had been clinging to a single mantra while trying to survive. Rachel couldn't stop wondering, had Emma stayed hidden because she feared pursuit, or had she believed she was protecting something? Later that day, they hiked back to the site where Scout had led them, taking a new route that followed the terrain from the direction he'd first emerged. Scout was moving better now, bandages secured, and though his steps were still cautious, his tail no longer drooped. He moved with purpose again, and the team trusted his instincts more than any compass. They passed the ravine, then climbed a narrow ridge where the air grew thinner and the trees leaned in tightly, like sentinels sharing secrets. There, just past a twisted old cedar, they discovered another of Emma's cameras, this one hidden beneath a camouflaged net of leaves and lichen, mounted high on a tree as if placed in haste. Rachel held her breath as Luke carefully removed the SD card and packed it in a sealed case. Back at the station that evening, Luke loaded the new card. The first few shots were standard foxes, owls, tracks in the snow, But then came a short burst of images that stole the room's breath. A series of 7 rapid exposures showed Emma, standing with her back to the camera, turning sharply, eyes wide with what could only be described as alarm. The background behind her shimmered strangely, as though the light itself had bent around. Something, in the final image, a faint distortion, hung in the trees, transparent, vague, but unmistakably humanoid in shape, like a ripple in glass. Then the camera feed ended. They sat in silence. Even Scout whimpered. Rachel leaned back, her voice steady despite the storm in her chest. She wasn't just lost. She was hiding from something she didn't understand. Ranger Denton nodded, slowly. "And if it's still out there, we need to know what we're walking into." That night, they locked the station, backed up every file, and drew up a new search plan. Rachel traced the route Emma had likely taken, connecting dots between her favorite photography spots and the hidden cameras. One trail emerged that no official map showed a line that led toward an abandoned sector of the park, known in old ranger logs as Dead Man's Hollow. It had been closed for decades due to unstable terrain, but now it seemed that was exactly where they needed to go. The old maps had long since stopped showing the trail to Dead Man's Hollow, what once had been a well-trodden path during the early days of Crater Ridge's founding had faded into nothing more than a memory whispered among the oldest rangers, a ghost route spoken of only when cautioning rookies where not to go. Landslides, unstable rock faces, unexplained animal behavior, those were the official reasons the area had been shut down, roped off, and left to be reclaimed by the forest. But as Rachel sat beneath the humming light of the ranger station, piecing together her mother's movements with the recovered photos and camera data, she realized with a growing certainty that Emma had gone there on purpose, not by accident, not by chance, but by intent. Scout stood at the door, ears perked, nose twitching at the cool morning air. He seemed to know what they were about to do. As the team loaded up with fresh supplies and the backup radio equipment Ranger Denton insisted on carrying, Rachel couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into a chapter of her mother's story that was never meant to be read. Yet, every instinct in her body screamed they had to go. Emma was out there, still out there, and she had left this trail for them to follow. By the time they reached the outer boundary of the closed zone, the weather had begun to shift. The sun was hidden behind a layer of dense cloud, and the wind had picked up, whispering through the trees with a tone that felt less like breeze and more like breath. A rusted warning sign, half consumed by ivy, marked the last known trailhead. Access restricted, trail closed. The metal creaked gently in the wind. Rachel brushed her fingers over the faded lettering and stepped beyond it. The forest changed almost immediately. The air was thicker, laced with a scent that reminded Rachel of wet stone and old roots. The trees grew closer together, their branches tangled like hands interlocked in silent prayer. The ground sloped steeply and unevenly, and with each step, the sense of being watched grew stronger. Not by something hostile, at least not yet, but by something ancient, something that had seen more than it had ever revealed. Scout moved with new intensity, nose pressed low, tail low but unwavering. They crossed overgrown switchbacks, clambered across fallen trees blanketed in moss, and ducked beneath natural arches formed by twisted limbs. Every few minutes they paused to mark their coordinates, but the radio signal had already begun to crackle with static, each transmission to the ranger base sounding more distant than the last. After nearly 3 hours of climbing, Scout led them to a clearing at the base of a towering rock face. There, leaning against the stone, was a wooden trail marker crudely carved, old, and yet unmistakably fresh. On it were the initials EC, etched deep with deliberate care. Rachel felt her throat tighten. Emma had stood here. She had left her mark, perhaps to signal direction, perhaps to tell Rachel something else, that she had come this far and made a choice to go further. Beyond the rock face, the forest thinned briefly, giving way to a narrow descent veiled in fog. A strange quiet had fallen over the land, so complete that even their footsteps felt blasphemous. Not a bird sang, not a squirrel moved. It was as though the woods were holding their breath. The path narrowed, winding into a corridor of stone walls and gnarled roots. As they moved, Carl whispered to no one in particular, "Feels like a place the earth tried to bury." No one responded. They just walked, listening. Then, without warning, Scout stopped. His body stiffened, nose lifted to the air. A low guttural growl rose from his throat. Rachel stepped beside him and followed his gaze. At the end of the path, just visible through the mist, stood a series of towering stone pillars, arranged in a rough circle. Time and weather had worn their edges, but their placement was too precise to be natural. They stood like guardians around the entrance to a hidden glade. Ranger Denton raised his binoculars and muttered, "What the hell is this place?" As they stepped inside the circle, the air seemed to shift. Rachel felt it as a vibration beneath her boots, a hum that ran through her spine and settled behind her eyes. The trees here were older, impossibly so, their trunks as wide as cars, and their bark blackened as if touched by fire long ago. At the center of the glade, beneath a canopy so thick it dulled the light, lay a scattering of stones arranged in a spiral within it. The ground was bare, no grass, no moss, only dark soil that looked recently disturbed. Luke crouched beside it, brushing gently with a gloved hand. Someone was here, recently, maybe even last night. Rachel looked around, her heart hammering. She could almost feel her mother's presence, like a warmth lingering just out of reach. Then Scout barked once, sharp and loud, and darted toward the far edge of the clearing. The others followed, stumbling through underbrush, until they reached the base of another ridge. There, half covered by ferns and tucked into the hillside, was a narrow cave entrance. Rachel stared into the dark opening, pulse racing. She stepped forward, her voice low. If she found this place, this might be where she hid. The others nodded. Carl pulled out a flashlight, and the team began to prepare for what lay beneath the earth. As Rachel stood at the mouth of the cave, Scout beside her, she felt the forest press in around them, not with hostility, but with warning. Whatever her mother had discovered, it had changed everything. And deep within these forgotten woods, the truth was waiting. The mouth of the cave exhaled a breath of damp, cold air that carried the earthy scent of stone, soil, and something else, something metallic, like rusted iron or blood long dried. Rachel stepped forward, brushing aside the curtain of ferns that veiled the entrance, her flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. The tunnel was narrow at first, barely tall enough to stand, with walls of jagged rock that funneled inward like the gullet of a beast. Scout remained close to her side, his ears pinned back, the fur along his spine standing rigid. Behind them, the others moved slowly, their lights casting shifting shadows that danced along the cave walls like spirits watching from another world. They advanced carefully, their boots crunching over gravel and old leaves that had blown in through the entrance. After several yards, the tunnel widened into a low-ceilinged chamber, where evidence of human presence broke through the natural stone scraps of fabric, an empty water bottle, and the unmistakable crumple of a granola bar wrapper. Rachel knelt down, her breath catching. It was the same brand Emma always carried. She looked up, her voice trembling. She was here. She rested here. The flashlight beam landed next on a small stack of stones in the corner, and atop them sat a battered notebook. It was torn and water-damaged, its spine barely holding the pages together, but the writing inside was still visible in places. June crouched beside her, carefully peeling open the first legible page. The handwriting was Emma's, scrawled, frantic, and broken by dirt smudges and water stains. The words were uneven, trailing off at times as if written in haste. "It's not just watching it understands. I made noise last night, and it came close. I heard it breathing." Rachel read the lines aloud in a whisper, the cave's stillness making her voice sound too loud. Another page read, "Light scares it, I think, or maybe it's just pretending. I don't know. I don't know anymore." A silence fell over the group, the weight of her mother's fear seeping into their bones. Carl pointed toward the back of the chamber, where a faint draft teased the edge of the wall. "There's another way out," he said. "Looks like a split in the rock." Rachel followed him to a narrow passage that angled sharply downward, a tight descent into what seemed like another level of the cave system. A frayed length of rope had been tied to a natural stone anchor, its end hanging like a lifeline cut short. Carl examined it, gore set. She tried to go down. Something must have happened. Without waiting, he tied a fresh rope to the same anchor, checked the knots, and began the descent. One by one, the team followed, their lights illuminating a vertical shaft, no wider than a chimney. At the bottom, the ground opened into a ravine-wide cold, and littered with the remnants of Emma's desperate survival. Rachel reached the bottom and froze. There, half buried in the loose dirt, was her mother's pack. She fell to her knees, brushing it off with trembling fingers. The zipper had been slashed, the contents spilled and weather-worn. a cracked thermos, a water filter, and a bundle of socks torn as if by claws or caught on something sharp. But what gripped her most was the journal tucked in the side pocket. This one was leather-bound, sturdier, protected from the elements. Inside were sketches, diagrams of the forest layout, markings Rachel recognized as her mother's shorthand for camera locations, but scattered throughout were drawings, figures, tall and strange, half-faded outlines that mirrored the shapes captured in the distorted images from the SD cards. Below one drawing, Emma had written, "It doesn't hunt. Like an animal, it waits." Luke stepped beside her, reading over her shoulder. "She was studying it," he murmured. "She wasn't just hiding, she was trying to understand it." Rachel's hands tightened around the journal. She thought she had time. She thought she could outlast it. Suddenly, Scout barked sharply, then growled low, turning toward the darkened crevice on the far side of the ravine. His hackles rose, his body stiff as a statue. The team followed his gaze, their flashlights converging on the shadows. A faint rustling echoed from within like feet on loose gravel. They held still, breath tight, ears straining. Then, just as suddenly, silence returned. Nothing emerged. The air, however, had changed. Heavier, more alert. Like the ravine itself was listening. "We should go," June said softly. "Get back while it's still light." No one argued. They climbed carefully, lifting Scout over the steeper rises, Rachel carrying Emma's pack like it was made of glass. Once they reached the cave's mouth again, the light outside had dimmed to a soft grey. The forest was quiet, the trees unmoving. But Rachel no longer trusted the silence. It felt orchestrated now, deliberate. They made their way back to the glade in hushed steps, retracing their path through the stone pillars. Rachel looked back. Once, expecting to see movement behind them. There was none. But the sensation remained in seen eyes, watching from just beyond the line of trees. That night, safe inside the ranger cabin, they catalogued everything they'd found. The notes, the pack, the sketches. Rachel placed the leather journal beside the SD cards on the table, forming a mosaic of her mother's final days, a woman not just surviving, but searching, observing, trying to leave behind something that made sense. But what if the thing she found didn't make sense at all? What if she'd stumbled upon something the world was never meant to see, and in doing so, had trapped herself between discovery and danger? Rachel sat up late, the lantern flickering beside her, Scout curled at her feet. She flipped through the journal again, staring at a final page where Emma had written a single line across the bottom. "If they find this, tell them to come quietly." Rachel closed the cover slowly. Tomorrow, they would go deeper, because whatever Emma had found, it wasn't finished with them yet. By morning, the ranger station felt more like a command post than a base camp. Maps were spread across the table, layered with trail markings, circles around areas now known to contain clues, and arrows charting the increasingly erratic route Emma had taken. Rachel stood, with her hands braced on the edge of the table, her mother's journal opened to the page where those haunting sketches lived. She stared at the lines, the elongated limbs, the hunched posture, the shimmering outline, noted again and again. They weren't the ramblings of someone lost. They were documentation, deliberate and increasingly frantic. Emma hadn't just witnessed something, she'd followed it, observed it, tried to learn its patterns, and somewhere along the way, it had begun watching her in return. Luke paced nearby, his arms crossed, expression tense. "You saw the way the bark was marked in the ravine. Those claw patterns were higher than any bear I've tracked, and way too wide. Whatever it is, it's big, and it knows how to stay hidden." Rachel nodded slowly. She said it didn't hunt. It waited. She turned toward the back of the room where Scout lay curled near the stove, twitching slightly in his sleep, paws moving as if retracing the trail in his dreams. That dog had gone farther than anyone thought possible. He had made it out, but something in his eyes, in the way he still flinched at sudden sounds, told her he had seen more than he could ever communicate. Denton entered the cabin, carrying a box of old ranger files he'd retrieved from the station archives. He set them down with a grunt and flipped open the top folder. "You won't find this in public reports," he said, voice low. "But back in '82, a hiker named Mark Wallace went missing up near the hollow. He was an experienced outdoorsman, former Forest Service employee. His dog came back alone, covered in cuts and shaking like it had walked through hell. They searched for a week, never found the guy, just his torn jacket and a broken compass. We chalked it up to an animal attack. But now, His words trailed off. Rachel leaned over the box and sifted through the faded papers. Among them was a yellowed news clipping with a headline, "Man disappears in Crater Ridge, dog returns alone." She scanned the brief story, heart pounding. Her mother had clipped the same article and kept it in the back of her journal. She had known, maybe even suspected, that whatever happened to Mark Wallace was connected to what she eventually found. The pieces were starting to align, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Luke pulled out a folded topographical map and spread it beside the files. "If we overlay her camera placement and the notebook sketches, there's a pattern forming." He traced a shaky loop with his finger. She wasn't just wandering, she was circling something, some central point. Rachel followed his hand. The spot he'd indicated was deep inside Deadman's Hollow beyond where they'd gone yesterday. An area marked only by vague contour lines and the occasional warning label. Unstable rock, no access, closed terrain. Carl, seated by the window, spoke up for the first time that morning. "I've seen this kind of thing before. Not exactly like this, but close. Back in Afghanistan, we had missions through mountain passes where locals refused to go. They said the land was cursed. Men would vanish, others would return different, quieter, not right. The terrain played tricks on you, or something in it did." He looked up, eyes hard. "I don't think this is just wildlife, and I don't think it's new." Rachel absorbed his words in silence. If there was something ancient buried within the folds of Crater Ridge, something that had always been there, watching, waiting, then maybe her mother had uncovered a truth older than the forest itself. The journal, the images, the claw marks, the frightened animals, it all painted a picture too big and too strange to ignore. But still, the most pressing truth pulsed beneath all the theories. Emma was still out there, alive, or at least, she had been. "We go back tomorrow," Rachel said, her voice steady. "We follow the pattern, go to the center." Denton frowned. "And if whatever's out there doesn't want us coming back?" Rachel looked him straight in the eyes. "Then, we don't go to provoke, we go to listen." Luke nodded. "We bring motion sensors, infrared, keep our footprints small, no loud movement, no lights unless necessary." Carl stood slowly. "And we bring backup, just in case." That evening, Rachel sat on the back steps of the station with Scout curled beside her. The stars had begun to prick through the dusky sky, and the air carried the scent of cold pine and wood smoke. She opened Emma's journal again, flipping to the last few pages. One was almost blank, except for a tiny notation scrawled in the bottom corner, "Look for the stone with the hollow ring." Rachel whispered it aloud. It sounded like a riddle, or a key. She looked down at Scout, who lifted his head and licked her hand. "We're close," she murmured. "A few more steps, and maybe this all starts to make sense." The night stretched out before them, quiet and waiting. And in the woods beyond, something listened. They made camp near the edge of the closed zone, just inside the thinning ring of ancient pines that encircled the hollow like sentinels. It was the kind of place where sound moved differently, where even their own voices felt dampened by the air. The trees stood tall and unmoving, not from lack of wind but from some deeper stillness. It was as though the forest was holding its breath. Rachel, wrapped in layers against the creeping cold, sat by the fire watching Scout chew quietly on a strip of dried meat. His eyes flicked to the darkness again and again, his ears rising at every subtle sound. He hadn't wagged his tail once since they'd arrived. Ranger, Denton and Carl had set up motion sensors around the camp's perimeter. The devices blinked softly, their silent vigil maintained by small solar units and lithium batteries. Luke had mounted a thermal camera facing the direction they planned to hike the next morning. The coordinates, they believed, marked the center of Emma's mapped trail pattern. June busied herself preparing a meal of canned stew and protein bars, her movements practiced and quiet. No one said much. The day's preparations had gone smoothly enough, but tension hung over the group like mist, refusing to lift. Rachel took out Emma's journal again, flipping back to the cryptic line her mother had written, "Look for the stone with the hollow ring." She'd read it a dozen times now, and still it lingered like a half-remembered dream. A stone that sounded hollow. Could it be a landmark, a natural formation, or something else entirely? She traced her fingers over the words, imagining her mother hunched in some dark place, carving her thoughts with a pen that may have been shaking in fear or clarity. As the fire dimmed and night settled fully around them, the group rotated into their night watch shifts. Rachel volunteered for first watch, claiming a seat near the sensors with a thick blanket and Scout beside her. She kept her flashlight off, relying on the faint glow of the embers and the moonlight slipping through. The branches, silence stretched, the kind of silence that pressed on the ears, where even the rustle of leaves felt like an intrusion. Scout remained alert but calm, his eyes tracking the tree line without a sound. An hour passed. Then two, and just as Rachel began to wonder if she might relax, one of the motion sensors let out a soft click and began to blink red. She froze. Scout stiffened instantly, rising to all fours with a low throaty growl that sent chills through her arms. She strained her eyes into the direction of the sensor, which faced a dense patch of underbrush about 40 yards out. Nothing moved, not a branch, not a bird. Rachel rose slowly and signaled to Carl, who had been resting under a tarp nearby. He joined her without a word, rifle slung over his shoulder, face unreadable. Together, they moved forward in silence, flashlights still off. Scout stayed tight to Rachel's leg, stepping without hesitation. When they reached the blinking sensor, Carl swept his beam across the undergrowth. It lit up in quick flares, ferns, fallen branches, tree trunks, but nothing else. Then, just as Rachel exhaled, her light caught something. Not eyes, not fur, but a print. A single footprint embedded in the soft earth, longer than any she'd seen before. Not a boot, not a paw, something in between. 4 deep toe impressions and a narrow heel, each indentation precise, deliberate. She knelt down, heart hammering. It was just here. Carl nodded, watching us, testing how close it can get. Rachel snapped a photo and marked the location. They returned to camp, where Denton and Luke were already awake, weapons nearby. No one tried to go back to sleep. At 3:17 a.m., the thermal camera picked up movement. Luke was the first to see it. The camera's screen flashed white for 2 seconds, showing a tall, humanoid figure moving between trees. Heat signature faint, but unmistakable. Then it was gone. No noise, no warning, just one brief glimpse. They rewound the footage 5 times. Always the same man, upright figure, arms hanging too low, torso unusually long, standing completely still before vanishing into the brush. Rachel stared at the image for a long time. She recognized the shape. It matched her mother's drawings almost perfectly. June broke the silence. If it's watching us like this, it knows we're coming. Tomorrow could be walking into its den. Denton looked to Rachel. We keep going. Rachel's voice was steady. Yes, but we move carefully. No trailblazing, no loud talking. We follow Emma's steps exactly, and we keep the cameras rolling. Dawn came slowly. A pale, reluctant light filtered through the canopy, turning the mist into layers of silver. Rachel packed the journal, the maps, and the sensor logs into her waterproof bag. Scout stayed at her side, tail down but steady. They would leave within the hour, heading toward the stone ring Emma had drawn on her last map. Whatever lay there, be it cave ruins, or something stranger, it was where the truth waited. That night had shown them something vital. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't blind instinct. It was curious, intelligent, cautious, and bold enough to step within feet of a firelit camp without a sound. It wasn't afraid of them. It was watching, calculating, waiting. But Rachel didn't flinch. Somewhere in that waiting, she believed her mother still lived. And as the forest awakened around them, one step closer to the heart of the unknown, Rachel made herself a promise. No matter what they found tomorrow, she would not leave this place without knowing the whole truth. The morning sun barely pierced the dense canopy as the team set off into the deepest part of the hollow, each of them moving with a deliberate, cautious rhythm shaped by the events of the night before. Rachel led the way, one hand steadying the compass, while the other gripped her mother's leather journal, now creased and worn from repeated readings. The page she kept open was the one with the map, hand-sketched lines, faint arrows, and a single shape at the center, a ring. Not a man-made structure, at least not in the traditional sense, but something ancient and circular, its presence somehow commanding in a way even her mother's notes couldn't explain. Emma had only written one word beside the sketch: boundary. Scout stayed glued to Rachel's hip, his gait taut with alertness. They walked in silence, each step crunching over damp pine needles, each soundbird call's wind, branches snapping magnified in the heavy hush of the woods. It was Denton who noticed it first. A subtle shift in the forest, a quiet to complete, a pattern to regular. "We're entering its territory," he said, voice hushed, as if afraid the trees might overhear. Rachel nodded. She could feel it, too, like they had passed through a veil, from one world into another that had rules they hadn't yet learned. The terrain sloped downward and grew rockier, moss clinging to every surface like nature's skin. The air turned cooler, damper, filled with the scent of stone and rain even though the sky remained dry. Then, just beyond a curve in the path, the trees gave way to a shallow bowl of land, carpeted in moss, and ringed with a dozen large stones, massive, upright, ancient. The formation was perfect. The stones, weathered by time, stood like sentries. Lichen covered their bases, and deep runes natural or carved. It was impossible to tell. Wrapped around their surfaces in spirals and broken lines. No moss grew. Inside the ring, no leaves gathered. The wind stopped at its edge, as if unsure it should cross. Rachel stepped forward and stood at the boundary. The air inside the circle oddly still. She hesitated for only a moment before placing one boot across the line. The shift was immediate, a low pressure against her ears, a strange warmth in the air, not threatening but unmistakable. Luke followed her in, scanning the stones with a careful eye. This is no accident. These were placed with intention. The symmetry, the spacing, it's too exact. Carl walked slowly along the perimeter, his fingers brushing the surface of one pillar. Feels older than anything we've got on record, pre-settler, maybe even pre-tribal, June added quietly, or not human at all. They made their way to the center, where the earth dipped slightly, forming a natural basin, and there, half buried in the soil, was the stone, the one Emma had written about. Rachel knew it before she even touched it. It was large and flat, shaped like a slab, but when she struck it gently with the butt of her flashlight, it rang not like a typical rock, but like something hollow, metallic, unnatural. The sound reverberated through the basin, not loud but deep, as if it echoed from beneath the forest floor. Everyone froze, even Scout. Rachel dropped to her knees and brushed away the dirt around the stone's edge. As she did, she uncovered markings, worn, but deliberate. They weren't words, they weren't symbols she recognized, but there was rhythm to them, a repeated geometry that suggested meaning or memory. She found this, Rachel whispered. This was what she meant. The hollow ring. Denton crouched beside her, eyes narrowed. It might be a lid, a capstone, something covering what's below. Luke studied the surrounding ground. We'd need to dig, but whatever's under there, it's been sealed a long time, maybe centuries. Rachel ran her hand across the surface one last time. She wasn't just trying to hide from something, she was trying to protect something. Then, from the trees behind them, a sound, a branch snapping, sharp and loud. Through the silence, everyone turned, weapons raised. Scout bared his teeth, his growl vibrating in Rachel's bones. A figure stood at the edge of the ring, no more than a shadow at first. Then it moved forward one step, tall, thin, limbs too long, shoulders hunched unnaturally. Its eyes reflected the light like glass, not red, not glowing, just reflective, like an animal's at night. It didn't make a sound, it didn't bare teeth or snarl. It just watched, measured, waited. For several long seconds, no one moved. Then Rachel did something no one expected. She reached slowly into her bag and took out her mother's journal. Holding it open, she stepped forward to the edge of the ring. "You've seen her," she said, voice steady. "Emma Collins. You've seen her." The figure didn't respond, but Rachel swore she saw its head tilt, the same way a person might when trying to understand something unfamiliar. Scout didn't growl now. He stood still, watching as if uncertain himself. Rachel took another step. She wasn't here to hurt you. She was here to understand. The forest held its breath. Then the figure turned and disappeared into the trees, silent as a breeze, gone before anyone could blink. Not running, not afraid, just finished. No one spoke for a long while. Then Carl broke the silence. "It's not mindless. That thing, thinking, deciding." Rachel looked back down at the stone. "And I think it wants us to find what's under here." They began unpacking their tools. It would take hours, maybe more, but they would dig. They would uncover whatever Emma had found. Because the forest had stopped pushing them back. It had opened its hand, and the truth, whatever it was, waited just beneath their feet. The first strike of the shovel into the moss-covered soil echoed like a whisper through the ring of stones, a sound swallowed almost instantly by the dense, waiting forest. Rachel dug with purpose, her muscles aching from days of travel, but driven. by something deeper than fatigue. This was the place. She knew it. Emma had found this stone, had marked it in her journal with urgency, and now Rachel stood over it, peeling back the layers of earth that had kept its secret hidden for who knew how long. Luke worked beside her, his sleeves rolled up, face streaked with sweat and soil, while Carl and Denton circled the perimeter, eyes constantly sweeping the trees for signs of movement. No one spoke of what they'd seen the day before, the figure at the forest's edge, the uncanny intelligence in its eyes, but the memory lingered in the way their hands trembled, in the way even Scout didn't stray far from Rachel's side. As the dirt gave way to compacted clay, the hollow resonance beneath their feet grew clearer. The stone was indeed a lid large, slightly convex, and set into a shallow basin of worked stone that didn't belong to any natural formation. June ran her fingers over the edge, then looked at Rachel with quiet certainty. This was built, buried on purpose. They cleared the remaining soil from the seam that circled the stone. Underneath the moss and centuries of decay, thin grooves could be seen cut into the ring's surface, radiating outward like the petals of a strange flower. Emma had drawn those grooves in her sketches. She'd left clues not just in words, but in shape, in feeling, in layers only someone who loved her could peel back. Carl found the first handhold a small notch on the edge of the stone slab, just big enough to grip. With all of them working together, they managed to shift it, inch by inch, until, with a final strained pull, the capstone tilted, then slid off to the side, revealing the dark mouth of a shaft below. The air that rushed out was cold and dry, not the stale rot of death, but something older, stiller. Rachel leaned over the edge and aimed her flashlight into the pit. Stone steps descended into the darkness in a slow spiral, carved with precision, and almost entirely intact. She turned to the others, voice steady. She went down there. I know it. They rigged ropes and lights, each of them descending slowly, one by one, until the forest above was just a green smear high above their heads. The stone spiral led them down for at least 50 feet before opening into a chamber unlike anything they had expected. The walls were smooth, carved into deliberate shapes, with arches that echoed the stone ring above. In the center stood a raised dais, and on it lay a box rectangular, metallic, blackened by time. Symbols none of them could read shimmered faintly along its surface, reflecting the flashlight beams in irregular patterns. Rachel approached it slowly, heart pounding. This is what she found. This is what she was protecting. She reached out and touched the box. The surface was cold, too cold for how long it had been buried. As soon as her fingers met the metal, a low hum stirred the silence, not from the box, from the chamber itself. Luke stepped forward. Something just activated. Do you hear it? Everyone nodded. It wasn't just sound, it was vibration, a frequency low enough to be felt in the spine, not heard with the ears. The box remained closed, but it seemed alive now, like it recognized their presence. Rachel moved to one side and saw it, then an inscription carved into the base of the dais, and beneath the dust and grime, 3 initials, ECEMMA. Collins had been here. She had seen this, and for some reason, she had left it behind. They searched the chamber carefully. On the far wall, half buried behind a crumbled panel, Carl found a sleeping bag, a notebook, a small plastic case of food rations. It was a makeshift camp. Rachel ran to it and opened the notebook. Her mother's handwriting, dozens of pages, filled with dated entries, diagrams, and final thoughts. The last entry was scrawled, jagged from either fatigue or desperation. It wants to be understood. It doesn't kill unless provoked. It remembers things we forgot. I think it guards this place. I stayed too long. I asked too many questions. If you're reading this, don't open the box. Not yet. Just listen. Rachel sat in the dirt and held the notebook to her chest. Her mother had lived here, hidden here, survived here 4 days, maybe longer. She had found something not just rare, but impossible, a relic buried so deep in time that even the oldest myths had forgotten it. Whatever the creature was, guardian, sentinel, or something beyond, Emma had seen it, had learned from it, and had left behind a warning. The hum continued, deeper now, vibrating through the soles of their boots and into their ribs. Scout whimpered. June whispered, "We shouldn't be here any longer." Rachel nodded slowly. "We document everything, take her notes, seal this back, and we go." One by one, they climbed out, hauling themselves back into the forest's pale afternoon light. The ring of stones was exactly as they'd left it, still waiting. As Carl and Luke carefully rolled the capstone back into place, the hum ceased. The air quieted. The woods returned to their strange, fragile balance. Rachel looked around the clearing, then at her mother's words in her hand. The box would stay where it was. For now, whatever it held had been guarded for centuries, and Emma Collins had become its last keeper. Now, it was Rachel's turn. The forest seemed different on the way out. The air no longer felt heavy with tension, but reverent, almost solemn, as if the land itself recognized that something sacred had been disturbed and respected. Rachel walked at the head of the group, Emma's journal pressed against her chest like a relic, her fingers smudged with the dirt of the chamber, her mind spinning with all they had seen and the weight of all they hadn't. Behind her, Carl carried the box of carefully sealed notes and Emma's final diary, while Luke and June walked in silence, eyes scanning the trees, not for fear, but for signs of understanding. The creature had not returned, not visibly, but they felt it, each of them in their own way. Not the dread of being hunted, but the undeniable presence of something old and awake. Now aware of them in turn, Scout trotted quietly at Rachel's side, his gait relaxed for the first time in days. Every now and then, he would glance toward the trees, but no longer with suspicion. It was as though the wilderness had accepted them, allowed them to pass, trusted that the boundary had not been violated. They had taken nothing but knowledge, and in doing so, they had honored whatever unwritten rule had kept that secret buried beneath the forest floor for generations. By midday, the team reached the edge of the restricted zone where the undergrowth grew thicker and the signs of man began to return. Old ranger blazes, trailside markers, the distant chirp of birds, unafraid to sing again. Rachel paused once, turning back for a final look at the direction they had come from. It was impossible to tell where the hollow began now. The forest had already started to erase their path, but she didn't need the markers. She had the memory, and the journal, and something else she couldn't yet name. An unspoken responsibility passed from Emma to her, now etched into her bones. They arrived at the ranger station as dusk painted the sky in bands of violet and deep blue. The porch light flickered on as Denton flipped the switch, and the soft hum of electricity was a welcome return to the familiar. Inside, the group worked quickly but methodically, downloading the thermal camera footage, cataloging the soil samples, organizing Emma's pages in chronological order. Luke copied everything to 2 separate drives, while June photographed every page and object from multiple angles. Carl, ever the quiet presence, moved from task to task without a word, but his eyes lingered on the journal more than once, especially the last entry where Emma had warned them not to open the box. Rachel didn't speak much either. She sat at the table, reading every line of her mother's notes again, absorbing the way the writing shifted from scientific observation to something more personal, almost spiritual. Emma had started as a biologist, passionate, methodical, exacting, but over the days, her tone had changed. She'd begun to refer to the creature not as it, but as he. She described his movements with care, recorded his visits as if they were rituals. One passage stood out more than the rest. "He knows I see him not as a threat but a guardian. I think he's beginning to trust me too. There's something in the way he watches, not like prey, like a student watches a teacher, like he's waiting to pass something on." Rachel closed the journal softly. Her throat tightened with emotion, but not the kind that brought tears. Something fuller, a recognition of depth, of truth, not just discovered but inherited. Emma hadn't simply vanished. She had transformed. She had found something beyond science, beyond explanation, and she had chosen to stay, not as a prisoner, but as a witness. Late that night, after the others had gone to bed, Rachel sat on the back steps of the cabin, wrapped in a blanket with Scout curled at her feet. The stars overhead burned clear and bright, and for the first time in weeks, she felt the night was not something to be feared. She opened Emma's journal to the blank final page and pulled out a pen. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote, "We came, we listened, we understood, and we left it untouched." When she finished, she looked down at Scout. He raised his head, blinked at her, and gave a soft huff, as if satisfied. She smiled. "We'll come back," she whispered, "but not to dig, not to disturb, just to remember." In the weeks that followed, the team published nothing. No reports, no documentaries. They stored the files securely, made copies, and sent one to a small, private archive that Rachel trusted more than any institution. They marked the hollow on the maps as a high-risk conservation area prone to rockfall, unsafe terrain, impassable zones. The story would end there for the public, and that was exactly how it should be. Rachel stayed in the ranger station for a while, walking the trails her mother once roamed, watching the seasons shift. Spring melted into summer, and the trees turned lush and full. Sometimes she would find herself pausing at a trail bend, heart fluttering, convinced she'd see a shadow move just out of reach, but it never came close again. It didn't need to. The message had already been delivered. On the last day before returning to her life beyond the trees, she hiked once more to the edge of the hollow, not inside, just to the boundary line. There, she knelt and placed a small wooden marker at the base of an old pine. Carved into it were the initials EC, and beneath them a single word, witness. She stood there a long time, listening. The wind stirred the leaves, and far off, the faint cry of an owl echoed through the dusk. No footsteps, no growls, no shadowy figures, just the forest, breathing in peace again. Rachel touched the marker one last time. "Goodbye, Mom," she said. "You were never lost. You just followed the truth farther than anyone dared." Then she turned and walked away, her path now clear, the final trail behind her no longer leading into fear, but into understanding. And so, our journey through the forest comes to an end, not just a search for a missing woman, but a discovery of something far greater, the bond between a mother and daughter, the mysteries that still live deep in nature, and the quiet strength of those who choose to listen rather than disturb. We hope this story left you not just with chills, but with wonder, because sometimes the things we don't understand aren't meant to be feared, but respected. Thank you, truly, for staying with us through the entire tale. Your time, your presence, and your open heart mean the world to us. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss a new story, and most importantly, leave a comment below. We'd love to hear what you felt, what surprised you, or even a strange or powerful story from your own life. Let's keep this space warm, curious, and full of wonder, just like the stories we share. Until next time, take care of yourself, and always keep listening.